In the year 1070, the German chronicler Adam of Bremen visited Uppsala to witness a Blot sacrifice. He described how animals and people were sacrificed to the Old Norse gods Odin, Thor and Frej. Today I'm gonna witness a spring Blot sacrifice in the same location 953 years later. First of all, I know that you're gonna be disappointed, but there won't be any human sacrifice today. But there will be a pagan ritual that's taken place here every year since the year 2000. Blot used to be a traditional sacrifice to the Old Norse gods, and it was first mentioned in Icelandic tales from the 9th century. 3 annual sacrifices were mentioned in those tales: Yule Blot, also known as Midwinter Blot, Autumn Blot, and Spring Blot. Later tales from Scandinavia also talk about even more sacrifices. For example, Disablot in February, Midsummer Blot, Harvest Blot, and Alvablot. Alvablot means elf blot, but we're not talking about Lord of the Rings elves here. In Old Norse mythology, elves were actually pretty vaguely defined. Sometimes they're extremely powerful beings equal to the gods, and sometimes they're just supernatural beings in general, and sometimes they're just minor sprites. The Blot sacrifices were traditionally dedicated to the gods, but they could also be dedicated to the elves, and you might think that that's where the name Alvablot comes from. But things are never that simple. Alva is also an alternative name for the goddess of death, Hel, so Alvablot is actually connected with the goddess of death instead. Either way, I'm gonna leave both elves and Hel for another day, and instead I'm gonna focus on the spring Blot sacrifice today. Fornsed is a Swedish term that means ancient customs, and it's also the name of a Swedish pagan religious community. The community has no religious dogma, and instead it focuses on natural spirituality inspired by Old Norse traditions. More than 600 people are part of Fornsed, and they have been arranging Blot sacrifices here at the historical site of Old Uppsala since the year 2000. They observe a lot of other holidays throughout the year: Julblot, Midsummer Blot, Disablot, Alvablot, and even some newly invented ones. But the biggest event in the community is this yearly spring Blot. What is it that's so fascinating about Fornsed?
Fornsed, or Norse Paganism, is for me like a spiritual home. I really feel a real connection to these gods. And the first time I did anything with Samfundet Fornsed, that is the organization behind this, it was also in Uppsala in spring. I was a participant in the spring Blots back in 2008. And during several years I was part of the group that arranges this Blot. And it's always great fun. It's like a festival and a lot of familiar faces.
What's the most positive thing about being part of Fornsed?
That's like a big question, you know? There's so many parts in life. You have the aspect of community and community building, then the fellowship and like-minded, in celebrating our connection to life, the life force, Megin, and the Old Norse words for life force and to spirit that we walk with every day, and then to share that with other two-leggeds and with four-leggeds, three-leggeds.
Three-legged, that's Frej.
Oh, yes. Why, of course, that's Freyr. Yeah. And the powers, gods and goddesses is most commonly used. I See, I prefer to use the powers because the thirst is another primal force that we dance with, and we are of that as well.
Blot takes place in Old Uppsala, which is an old Viking and pre-Viking settlement close to the modern town of Uppsala. In the Vendel Age, roughly 550 AD up until the Viking Age, Uppsala became a center for trade and wealth was accumulated here. During that time, the royal mounts of Uppsala were raised. People believed that these mounts were dedicated to the gods Odin, Thor and Frej. By the way, if you decide to visit the royal mounts of Uppsala, don't do what those guys are doing. You're not allowed to climb these mounts. People lived here for hundreds of years, but by the year 1164 they decided to combine the town of Uppsala with the nearby town of Eastern Aros to create what's known as Uppsala today. Before that happened, the German chronicler Adam of Bremen visited Uppsala in 1070, and he documented the rituals surrounding the Blot sacrifice. It was a very different Blot then compared to now. Back then it was an obligatory ritual that everyone had to attend. Men and women and animals were sacrificed to the gods and then hung up in a grove close to the temple. Christians who didn't want to attend the Blot had to pay a fine, and everyone had to send a contribution to the sacrifice, kings and servants alike. Today it's still a very impressive ritual, but there's a lot less human sacrifice, and animal sacrifice as well for that matter. It is a bit less impactful to stick a knife into, for example, a box of jelly donuts, but the Blot sacrifice doesn't have to be a blood sacrifice. The meaning of the word Blot in Old Norse is simply to worship or sacrifice, so there's nothing specifying that it has to be a blood sacrifice. But the words do sound pretty similar, so I think it's safe to say that there's some sort of connection between the modern word blood and the pagan ritual of Blot. The spring Blot used to be dedicated to the gods Odin, Thor and Frej. You all know about Odin, highest of the Aesir, and Thor, mightiest of the Aesir. I mentioned Aesir specifically because there was actually another race of gods, the Vanir. Frej, the third of the gods worshipped at the spring Blot, was one of the Vanir. In the mythological Old Norse history, there was a war between the Aesir and the Vanir. Njord was one of the Vanir who ended up hostage with the Aesir. Njord had two children, Frej and Freya, and they ended up raised by Odin and the Aesir and became powerful gods alongside them. Frej was a god of fertility, and the Swedish word for seed, frö, has its roots in his name. His sister Freya was also a goddess of fertility, as was their mother Njord, but there are subtle differences. Freya was more like a combination of a goddess of fertility and a goddess of love, and also a goddess of war for some reason, even though Odin was also a god of war. The nuance of which aspect each god or goddess was in charge of is a little bit murky. But either way, Frej was one of the Vanir, but still a very highly regarded god. Blood sacrifice was a big part of the Blot back in the olden days. People would sacrifice animals and smear blood on carvings of the gods to honor them. During the midwinter Blot, a large hog would be sacrificed to Frej, and that's actually where the Scandinavian tradition of eating Christmas ham comes from. But it wasn't just animals that were being sacrificed. Slaves and prisoners of war were often sacrificed as well during these Blot rituals. And they also sacrificed their own sons and daughters, and in certain cases even their kings when they really needed to offer up something valuable. The winters were harsh and the gods needed to be appeased so that the tribe could survive for one more year. The sacrifices were performed by the elders of each house. There weren't any specific priests in Old Norse religion. They did have houses dedicated to the gods though, where people gathered during these rituals. The tradition of Blot took a long time to die out, even after Christianity came to Sweden. Blot sacrifices continued into the 11th century, and as late as the 19th century there were still animal sacrifices being performed in the county of Småland. People would bury cattle in an attempt to appease earth spirits and save the rest of the herd from disease. You know, I'm not saying that you should believe in these old pagan gods, but isn't it a bit of a coincidence that yesterday it was still freezing cold and today is actually the first day of spring? Maybe these guys are onto something. The Blot today isn't an Old Norse Blot, but it's still a religious ceremony. This is a way for people to commune with gods and higher powers and to offer symbolic sacrifices to those powers. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to perform these rituals. The important thing is that you offer thanks to these higher powers. You can also ask for favors or simply wish for the well-being of yourself and your loved ones. This is a social event with focus on spirituality and acceptance. It's tempting to say that this is probably very different from the bloody sacrifices of ages past, but I'm not so sure. I can imagine that people stood here more than 1,000 years ago feeling the same things that people are feeling today. We live in a very different world today, but we still have the same hopes and fears as our ancestors, and the same desires. Well, except that I don't fear that Thor will put a lightning bolt through my head, or that the Fimbul winter is upon us. I just fear global warming, rising crime rates, and that the economy is crashing. But other than that, we're basically the same. And there you have it. That was a quick look at the Spring Blot celebration in Old Uppsala. I hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day. Oh, by the way, if you want to see more of Uppsala, check out this video as well. I'm gonna put it right here.